The rain hammered against the ancient stone walls of Blackmoor Castle as Thomas Hartwell adjusted his ceremonial sword for the 100th time that evening. 27 years old and built like a fortress himself, Thomas had served as a royal sentinel for 5 years. His dark hair was always perfectly groomed, his uniform pressed to perfection, and his loyalty to the crown absolute. Tonight felt different, though. Something in the air made his skin crawl with unease. The castle had been buzzing with strange energy for weeks. Servants whispered in corners, stopping their conversations whenever Thomas walked by. The other guards seemed nervous, constantly checking over their shoulders. Even the kitchen staff, usually cheerful and loud, had become quiet and jumpy. Thomas noticed everything. It was his job to notice everything. Lady Camilla Worthington had arrived at court 3 months ago. She was supposed to be a distant cousin of the Queen, sent from the northern provinces to serve as a lady-in-waiting. Beautiful in a way that made grown men stumble over their words, Camilla had flowing auburn hair and emerald green eyes that seemed to see straight through a person. She was 24, unmarried, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly how powerful her beauty was. From the moment she stepped foot in the castle, things changed. The king, who had been married to Queen Isabella for 15 years, suddenly started taking longer walks in the gardens. He began hosting private dinners that lasted well into the night. The Queen, once vibrant and commanding, had become pale and withdrawn. She spent most of her time in her chambers, claiming illness, though the royal physician found nothing wrong with her. Thomas had been assigned to guard duty in the royal wing for the past month. His post was at the end of the long corridor that led to the royal bedchambers. He knew every sound that building made, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the windows. Lately, he had been hearing things that made no sense. Footsteps in the hallway at odd hours, hushed conversations behind closed doors, doors opening and closing when they should have remained locked. Tonight was his regular shift, starting at 10 in the evening and running until 6 in the morning. The castle was supposed to be quiet by now. The king and queen should have retired to their separate chambers hours ago. The servants should be asleep in their quarters. But Thomas could feel that something was wrong. His instincts, honed by years of military training before joining the Royal Guard, were screaming at him. As he walked his route down the corridor, checking each door and window, Thomas heard something that made him freeze. It was coming from Lady Camilla's chambers, which were located in a section of the royal wing, reserved for important guests. The sound was muffled, but it definitely sounded like voices. Two voices. One was clearly female, probably Camilla herself. But the other voice was deeper, masculine, and seemed familiar in a way that made Thomas's stomach twist. The royal sentinel had been trained never to intrude on the privacy of the nobility without absolute cause. Eavesdropping was not just forbidden, it was a crime punishable by exile or worse. But something about this situation felt dangerous. Thomas had sworn an oath to protect the crown and everyone in the castle. If someone was threatening Lady Camilla, he needed to investigate. If she was entertaining an unauthorized guest, that was also a serious security breach. Moving silently on feet, trained for stealth, Thomas approached Camilla's door. The voices were clearer now, though still muffled by the thick wooden door. He could definitely make out two people having what sounded like an intense conversation. The male voice was speaking in urgent, hushed tones. The female voice responded with what sounded like both passion and frustration. Thomas pressed his ear closer to the door, knowing he was crossing a line but unable to stop himself. The conversation seemed to be about meeting times, about secrecy, about being careful not to get caught. His blood ran cold as he began to understand what he might be witnessing. This was not just any unauthorized visitor. This was something much more dangerous. The floorboards beneath his feet creaked slightly, and the voices inside the room stopped instantly. Thomas held his breath, pressing himself against the wall beside the door. For several long moments, there was complete silence. Then he heard movement inside the room, footsteps crossing the floor, and what sounded like someone moving toward the door. Panic shot through Thomas's system. If he was caught eavesdropping, his career would be over. But if he left now, he might miss evidence of something that could threaten the entire royal family. The training kicked in, and he made a quick decision. Moving swiftly and silently, He positioned himself at the end of the corridor where he could observe Camilla's door, while appearing to be conducting a normal patrol. The door to Camilla's chambers opened slowly. Thomas watched from the shadows as a figure emerged, keeping to the darkness along the walls. The person was tall, wearing a dark cloak with the hood pulled up. They moved with the confidence of someone who knew the castle well, someone who belonged there. But no one should have been in Lady Camilla's chambers at this hour except Lady Camilla herself. The cloaked figure moved down the corridor in the opposite direction from where Thomas was positioned. They seemed to know exactly where they were going, taking turns and navigating the maze of hallways with the skill of someone who had walked these paths many times before. Thomas had a choice to make. He could follow the figure and try to identify them, or he could investigate Camilla's chambers to see if she was safe. His duty as a protector won out. Thomas waited until the cloaked figure disappeared around a corner, then moved quickly toward Camilla's door. He needed to make sure she was unharmed and find out what had just transpired. The security of everyone in the castle could depend on what he discovered in the next few minutes. As he approached the door, Thomas could hear movement inside the room. Someone was definitely awake and moving around. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What exactly was he going to say? How could he explain why he had been listening at her door without admitting to behavior that could get him dismissed from the royal guard? Before he could decide on the right approach, the decision was made for him. The door swung open, and Lady Camilla stood there in her nightgown, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders and her green eyes wide with what looked like fear. She was beautiful even in her apparent distress, but there was something else in her expression. Guilt. The kind of guilt that came from being caught doing something forbidden. "Sir Thomas," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "What are you doing here? Is everything all right?" Thomas studied her face carefully. Lady Camilla was trying to appear calm, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the door. Her cheeks were flushed, and her breathing seemed elevated. Most tellingly, she was blocking the entrance to her chambers, positioning her body to prevent him from seeing inside. "My lady," Thomas said formally, "I heard voices and wanted to ensure your safety. Is there anyone else with you?" The question hung in the air between them. Thomas watched as several emotions flickered across Camilla's face. Surprise, calculation, and then something that looked almost like defiance. "Voices?" she repeated, tilting her head as if confused. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Sir Thomas. I was just reading before bed. Perhaps you heard me reading aloud to myself. I sometimes do that when I'm having trouble sleeping." It was a reasonable explanation, but Thomas didn't believe it for a second. He had clearly heard two distinct voices, and the conversation had definitely been between two people. Moreover, the man he had seen leaving her chambers was evidence that someone else had been there, regardless of what Lady Camilla claimed. "Of course, my lady," Thomas said carefully. "However, for security purposes, I will need to check your chambers to ensure no unauthorized persons are present. It's standard protocol when there's been a report of unknown voices in the royal wing." Camilla's eyes flashed with something between anger and panic. "That won't be necessary, Sir Thomas. I can assure you that I am quite alone and perfectly safe. There's no need for you to enter my private chambers." But Thomas had caught something else. Behind Lady Camilla, barely visible in the dim light from her fireplace, he could see that her bed was rumpled, and there appeared to be two wine glasses on the table near the window. One was empty, but the other still had wine in it. Unless Lady Camilla had been drinking alone and using two glasses for some reason, someone else had definitely been in that room recently. The evidence was mounting, but Thomas still had no idea who the mysterious visitor had been or what their presence meant for the security of the castle. What he did know was that Lady Camilla was lying to him, and that meant this situation was far more serious than a simple social call. "My lady," Thomas said, his voice becoming more formal and authoritative, "I'm afraid I must insist. Royal protocol requires that I investigate any potential security breach. If you are indeed alone, then a quick inspection will confirm that and put the matter to rest." The standoff continued for several tense moments. Lady Camilla seemed to be weighing her options, calculating whether she could continue to refuse without making the situation worse for herself. Finally, she stepped aside, but her expression made it clear that she was not happy about it. "Very well, Sir Thomas. she said coldly. "But I want it noted that I am cooperating under protest. This is highly irregular and an invasion of my privacy." Thomas entered the chamber, his hand resting on his sword hilt, out of habit rather than expectation of danger. The room was elegant, decorated in deep blues and golds, with a large fireplace that cast dancing shadows on the walls. His eyes immediately went to the details that supported his suspicions. The 2 wine glasses, the rumpled bed, and something else he hadn't noticed from the doorway. On the floor near the window, partially hidden under a chair, was a man's glove. It was made of fine leather, the kind worn by nobility or high-ranking officials. Thomas bent to pick it up, and Lady Camilla's sharp intake of breath confirmed that she had seen it too. "This appears to belong to a man, my lady," Thomas said, holding up the glove. "Can you explain how it came to be in your chambers?" The color drained from Camilla's face, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I have no idea how that got there. Perhaps one of the servants dropped it while cleaning." It was another lie, and they both knew it. Male servants were not permitted in the private chambers of unmarried ladies, especially not in the evening. Any cleaning or maintenance was done during the day by female staff members. The presence of a man's glove in Lady Camilla's room at this hour could only mean one thing. Thomas was beginning to understand the full scope of what he had stumbled upon. Lady Camilla had been entertaining a male visitor in her chambers late at night, in direct violation of castle protocol and moral standards. But the identity of that visitor was still a mystery, and that mystery could have serious implications for everyone in the castle. As he continued his inspection of the room, Thomas found more evidence. A second cloak hanging in the wardrobe that was clearly sized for a man. A letter on the writing desk that had been hastily covered by other papers but was still partially visible. Most damning of all, the faint scent of a particular cologne that Thomas recognized but couldn't quite place. "Lady Camilla," Thomas said, turning to face her directly, "I need you to tell me who was in this room tonight. This is no longer a matter of propriety. This is a matter of castle security, and potentially a matter of treason depending on who your visitor was." The word treason hit Lady Camilla like a physical blow. Her composure finally cracked, and Thomas could see real fear in her eyes. She sank into a chair by the fireplace, her hands shaking as she realized the serious nature of the situation she had created. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You don't understand what this could mean for all of us. If this becomes known, if people find out what's been happening, it will destroy everything." Thomas felt his heart rate increase. Whatever was going on was clearly much more significant than he had initially realized. The fear in Lady Camilla's voice suggested that this was not just about a forbidden romance. This was about something that could indeed threaten the stability of the kingdom itself. "Then help me understand, my lady," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm. "Tell me what's been happening, and perhaps we can find a way to handle this situation that protects everyone involved." Lady Camilla looked up at him with tears in her eyes. For a moment, Thomas thought she was going to confess everything. Then her expression hardened again, and she shook her head. "I can't," she said simply. "I can't tell you anything, Sir Thomas. You'll have to do whatever you think your duty requires. But I cannot and will not reveal who was here tonight." The conversation had reached an impasse, but Thomas knew he could not let this matter rest. Too much was at stake, and too many questions remained unanswered. As he prepared to leave Lady Camilla's chambers, he made a decision that would change everything for all of them. "Very well, my lady," he said formally. "I will be reporting this incident to my superior officers in the morning. I strongly advise you to reconsider your position before then. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and it's usually better for everyone involved when it comes out sooner rather than later." As Thomas left Lady Camilla's chambers and resumed his patrol, his mind was racing with questions and possibilities. Who had been in that room? Why was Lady Camilla so terrified of revealing their identity? And most importantly, what did this mean for the safety and security of the royal family? The rest of his shift passed slowly, with Thomas replaying every detail of the encounter in his mind. By the time dawn broke over the castle walls, he had made a decision about what he needed to do next. The investigation was just beginning, and the answers he uncovered would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Thomas barely slept after his shift ended. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape. By the time he was due to report for his next duty period that evening, he had made a difficult decision. He would have to speak with Captain Morrison, the head of the Royal Guard, about what he had discovered. Captain Morrison was a veteran soldier in his 50s who had served the crown for over 30 years. He was known for his wisdom, his discretion, and his absolute loyalty to the royal family. If anyone could help Thomas navigate this delicate situation, it would be Morrison. But Thomas also knew that once he reported the incident, there would be no going back. The wheels of an official investigation would be set in motion. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Thomas knocked on the door of Captain Morrison's office. The older man looked up from a stack of reports, his weathered face creased with the kind of lines that came from years of making difficult decisions. "Hartwell," Morrison said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "You look like hell. What's troubling you?" Thomas took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the previous night. He told Morrison about the voices he had heard, the cloaked figure leaving Lady Camilla's chambers, and the evidence he had found in her room. Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Thomas finished his account, Morrison was quiet for several long minutes. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with concern. "This is a very serious matter, Thomas. If Lady Camilla is indeed entertaining unauthorized visitors in her chambers, it represents a significant security breach. But the implications could be much worse depending on who that visitor was." "That's what I'm afraid of, sir," Thomas replied. "Lady Camilla was terrified when I suggested that this could be a matter of treason. Her reaction suggested that she knows exactly how serious this situation is." Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out over the castle grounds. "There have been rumors," he said quietly. "Nothing concrete, you understand. Just whispers among the staff, observations from other guards. The king has been behaving strangely lately. More secretive, more agitated. The queen has been... well, you've seen how withdrawn she's become." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Sir, are you suggesting that the king might have been Lady Camilla's visitor?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Morrison said firmly. "But we need to find out the truth, and we need to find it out quickly. If there is indeed an inappropriate relationship developing between the king and Lady Camilla, it could destroy the monarchy. The people's faith in the crown depends on the moral authority of the royal family." The two men discussed their options. They could confront Lady Camilla directly and demand answers, but she had already shown that she was prepared to lie to protect whoever her mysterious visitor was. They could increase surveillance on her chambers, but that would require involving more guards and risking word of the investigation spreading throughout the castle. Or they could try to catch the visitor in the act during their next meeting. "The third option is our best bet," Morrison decided. "We'll set up discreet surveillance starting tonight. If this visitor returns, we'll identify them and then decide how to proceed based on who we're dealing with." That evening, Thomas returned to his regular post in the royal wing, but he was no longer alone. Two other trusted guards had been positioned at strategic points where they could observe the corridor leading to Lady Camilla's chambers without being seen. Morrison himself had taken a position in an unused room with a clear view of her door. The hours passed slowly. 10 o'clock came and went. Then 11. At midnight, Thomas was beginning to wonder if their mysterious visitor had been scared off by the previous night's close call. Then, at 12:30, he saw a familiar figure moving through the shadows. The same cloaked person from the night before was making their way down the corridor toward Lady Camilla's chambers. This time, however, Thomas was ready. He gave a prearranged signal to the other guards, and they began to quietly move into position to block any potential escape routes. As the cloaked figure approached Lady Camilla's door, Thomas got a better look at them. The person was definitely male, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. When the figure raised his hand to knock softly on the door, Thomas caught a glimpse of an ornate ring on his finger that made his blood run cold. It was the royal signet ring, the ring worn only by the king. Thomas felt like the world was spinning around him. He watched in horror as the door to Lady Camilla's chambers opened and she appeared, dressed in a silk robe that left little to the imagination. The king, for there was no longer any doubt about the visitor's identity, stepped inside quickly. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Morrison appeared at Thomas's side, his face pale in the dim light of the corridor. "Did you see what I saw?" he whispered. "The ring, sir. It was definitely the royal signet." Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, as if hoping that when he opened them, this nightmare would have disappeared. "God help us all," he murmured. "The king is having an affair with Lady Camilla." The implications of this discovery were staggering. King Edward had been married to Queen Isabella for 15 years. Their marriage had produced two children, Prince William and Princess Catherine, who were the heirs to the throne. The stability of the entire kingdom depended on the legitimacy and moral authority of the royal line. If word of the king's affair became public, it would be a scandal that could bring down the monarchy. The people expected their ruler to be above such base behavior. The church, which had blessed the king's marriage to the queen, would be outraged. Foreign allies might question whether they could trust a monarch who could not even honor his marriage vows. But the political implications were only part of the problem. There was also the personal tragedy of Queen Isabella, who had apparently been betrayed by her husband in the most public and humiliating way possible. And there were the children to consider. Prince William was only 12 years old, and Princess Catherine was 10. How would they cope with the knowledge that their father had destroyed their family? As Morrison and Thomas watched from their hidden position, they could hear muffled voices coming from Lady Camilla's chambers. Unlike the previous night, when the conversation had seemed urgent and secretive, tonight the voices were softer, more intimate. It was clear that this was not just a casual affair, but a relationship that had been developing for some time. "We need to hear what they're saying," Morrison whispered. "This could be just an affair, or it could be something even worse. If Lady Camilla is influencing the king's political decisions, if she's using her position to gain power or information, then we're looking at a potential threat to national security." Thomas nodded, understanding the full scope of what they were dealing with. They needed to gather more information before deciding how to proceed. Moving carefully, the two men positioned themselves closer to Lady Camilla's door, where they could make out the conversation inside. What they heard confirmed their worst fears. The king was indeed having an affair with Lady Camilla, but it was more than just physical attraction. The two were discussing political matters that should have been private between the king and his official advisors. Lady Camilla was asking about foreign policy decisions, about military preparations, about financial matters that affected the entire kingdom. Even more disturbing, Lady Camilla seemed to be pushing the king towards certain decisions that would benefit her own family's interests in the northern provinces. She was using her influence over him to shape policy in ways that could affect thousands of people. "We have to stop this," Morrison whispered urgently. "She's manipulating him, using his infatuation with her to gain political power. This has gone far beyond a simple affair." But even as Morrison spoke, Thomas was beginning to understand an even more terrible truth. Through the door, he could hear Lady Camilla speaking about Queen Isabella in terms that were not just dismissive, but actively hostile. She was encouraging the king to consider setting aside his marriage, to find legal grounds for dissolving his union with the queen so that he could marry her instead. The conversation took an even darker turn when Lady Camilla began discussing what would happen to the queen if such a plan were implemented. She spoke casually about sending Isabella to a convent, about removing her from public life permanently. The king, who should have been defending his wife's honor, was listening to these suggestions without protest. Thomas felt sick as he realized the full extent of what Lady Camilla was planning. This was not just an affair, or even just political manipulation. This was a calculated attempt to destroy the queen and position herself as the new royal consort, and she was using the king's weakness for her to accomplish it. "Sir," Thomas whispered to Morrison, "we have to protect the queen. If Lady Camilla is planning to move against her, Queen Isabella could be in real danger." Morrison nodded grimly. "We'll need to warn the queen, but we'll have to be extremely careful about how we do it. If the king finds out that we've discovered his affair, he could have us arrested or worse. We need solid evidence before we make any accusations." The two men continued to listen as the conversation inside Lady Camilla's chambers became more specific about timelines and methods. It was clear that Lady Camilla had been planning this campaign for months, possibly since she first arrived at court. Every interaction with the king had been calculated to draw him deeper into her web of influence. As the night wore on, Thomas and Morrison learned more details about the scope of Lady Camilla's ambitions. She had allies among certain nobles in the northern provinces who would support her claim to become queen. She had been gathering information about the kingdom's finances, military strength, and foreign relations that she could use to her advantage. Most chilling of all, she had been researching historical precedents for royal divorces and annulments. By the time the king prepared to leave Lady Camilla's chambers, around 3 in the morning, Thomas and Morrison had heard enough to understand the full danger facing the royal family. This was not just about adultery or even political manipulation. This was about a carefully planned coup that would replace Queen Isabella with Lady Camilla and potentially change the entire structure of the kingdom. As the king emerged from the chambers, once again wearing his concealing cloak, Morrison made a quick decision. Instead of confronting him immediately, they would follow him to see where he went and what he did next. This information could be crucial in understanding how deeply the king was involved in Lady Camilla's plans. The king made his way through the castle corridors with practiced stealth, clearly familiar with the route and timing needed to avoid detection. Thomas and Morrison followed at a distance, careful to stay in the shadows. They watched as the king returned to his own chambers, but instead of going to sleep, he went to his private study where he began writing what appeared to be letters. Through a window, they could see the king working by candlelight, his face intense with concentration. Whatever he was writing was clearly important, and Thomas had a terrible suspicion that the letters might be related to the plans he and Lady Camilla had been discussing. After watching for nearly an hour, Morrison finally made the decision to return to his office and plan their next move. The evidence they had gathered was overwhelming, but they needed to be strategic about how they used it. The fate of the kingdom might depend on their next actions. "Thomas," Morrison said as they walked back through the castle, "what we've learned tonight must remain absolutely secret until we decide how to proceed. We're dealing with forces that could destroy everything we've sworn to protect. One wrong move could mean the end of the monarchy as we know it." Thomas nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of responsibility that had suddenly been placed on their shoulders. They were no longer just guards protecting the castle from external threats. They had become the guardians of a secret that could change the course of history. As dawn began to break over the castle walls, Thomas realized that his simple patrol duty had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. The discovery of the king's affair was just the beginning. Now they had to find a way to protect Queen Isabella, preserve the monarchy, and stop Lady Camilla's ambitious plans without causing a political disaster that could tear the kingdom apart. The second night of investigation had provided answers, but those answers had only led to more questions and greater dangers. Thomas knew that the most difficult challenges still lay ahead, and that the decisions they made in the coming days would determine the fate of everyone in the castle, including themselves. The next morning brought an emergency that Thomas and Morrison had not anticipated. Queen Isabella, who had been growing increasingly withdrawn over the past weeks, had collapsed in her private chambers. The royal physician was called immediately, and soon rumors began spreading throughout the castle that the queen was gravely ill. Thomas and Morrison exchanged worried glances when they heard the news. Given what they had learned about Lady Camilla's plans the previous night, the timing of the queen's sudden illness seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. They needed to investigate immediately, but they also had to be careful not to reveal what they knew about the king's affair. Morrison managed to gain access to the queen's chambers by claiming that he needed to assess security arrangements around her sick room. What he found there confirmed his worst suspicions. The queen was indeed ill, but her symptoms suggested poisoning rather than natural disease. She was weak, nauseated, and showing signs of the kind of slow poisoning that would be difficult to detect without specific knowledge of what to look for. "We have to act quickly," Morrison told Thomas when he returned from his visit to the queen. "If Lady Camilla is indeed poisoning Queen Isabella, then every day we wait increases the risk that the queen will die. But we also can't make accusations without absolute proof." The two men decided to split their efforts. Morrison would work on gathering evidence about the queen's condition and potential poisoning, while Thomas would focus on watching Lady Camilla's activities to see if she was indeed the one responsible for the queen's illness. Thomas's surveillance of Lady Camilla proved revealing in ways he had not expected. Rather than appearing concerned about the queen's condition, Lady Camilla seemed almost excited by the news of Isabella's illness. She spent the morning writing letters, which she sent out by private messenger rather than through the castle's normal mail system. She also had several whispered conversations with servants who were not part of her usual household staff. Most damning of all, Thomas observed Lady Camilla meeting with a man he recognized as Dr. Marcus Blackwood, a physician who had been dismissed from royal service several years earlier for questionable practices. Blackwood had arrived at the castle that morning, supposedly as a visitor to Lady Camilla's cousin. But Thomas watched as the two of them held an intense conversation in the castle gardens where they thought they could not be observed. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together in a way that painted a terrifying picture. Lady Camilla was not just manipulating the king and planning to replace Queen Isabella as his wife. She was actively working to remove Isabella permanently through slow poisoning, using a disgraced physician to help her carry out the crime. Meanwhile, Morrison's investigation into the Queen's condition had yielded equally disturbing results. When he spoke privately with the royal physician, Dr. Harrison, the older man admitted that he had been puzzled by the Queen's symptoms. They were consistent with illness, but there were aspects of her condition that suggested external causes rather than natural disease. "I've been treating Queen Isabella for 3 weeks now," Dr. Harrison confided to Morrison. "Her symptoms keep changing in ways that don't make medical sense. Just when I think she's improving, she has another setback that's worse than before. It's almost as if something is interfering with her recovery." Morrison asked Dr. Harrison to conduct specific tests for common poisons, explaining that there were security concerns about the Queen's condition. The physician agreed, understanding the serious implications of what Morrison was suggesting. While Morrison and Thomas gathered evidence, events in the castle continued to unfold in Lady Camilla's favor. The king, distraught about his wife's illness and apparently unaware that it might not be natural, began spending even more time seeking comfort from Lady Camilla. She positioned herself as his main source of emotional support, making herself indispensable during his time of crisis. Thomas watched in disgust as Lady Camilla played the role of the caring, supportive companion, while simultaneously working to destroy the woman she was comforting the king about. Her manipulation was so skillful that even Thomas, who knew the truth about her plans, could almost believe in her sincerity when he saw her consoling the king. The investigation took a decisive turn when Dr. Harrison confirmed Morrison's suspicions. The Queen was indeed being poisoned, slowly and systematically, with a combination of substances that would be difficult to detect without specific testing. The poison was being administered in small doses over time, which would make the Queen's death appear natural when it eventually occurred. "This is incredibly sophisticated," Dr. Harrison explained to Morrison. "Whoever is doing this has extensive knowledge of medicine and toxicology. They're using a combination of substances that mimic natural illness while slowly destroying the Queen's organs. If we hadn't tested specifically for these compounds, we never would have discovered them." Armed with this evidence, Morrison knew they had to act immediately. But they also faced a terrible dilemma. If they accused Lady Camilla of poisoning the Queen, they would have to explain how they had discovered her plot. That would mean revealing the king's affair and potentially destroying the monarchy they were trying to protect. Morrison made a difficult decision. He would confront Lady Camilla privately first, giving her a chance to confess and hopefully find a way to resolve the situation without exposing the king's involvement. It was a risky strategy, but it offered the best chance of protecting both Queen Isabella and the stability of the kingdom. That evening, Morrison requested a private meeting with Lady Camilla in his office. She arrived looking confident and composed, apparently unaware that her plot had been discovered. Morrison decided to be direct, hoping that shock tactics might force her to reveal the full scope of her plans. "Lady Camilla," he began, "we know about the poison. We know that you've been systematically poisoning Queen Isabella, and we know about your relationship with the king." The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. Lady Camilla's composure cracked completely, her face going white with shock and fear. For a moment, Morrison thought she might faint. Then her expression hardened into something cold and calculating. "You have no proof," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Morrison placed a folder on his desk containing Dr. Harrison's test results and detailed documentation of Lady Camilla's suspicious activities. "We have extensive proof, my lady. The question now is what you're prepared to do to minimize the damage you've caused. Lady Camilla stared at the folder for several long moments, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she looked up at Morrison with eyes that were both defiant and desperate. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," she said. "The king loves me. He wants to be with me. Isabella is a weak, pathetic woman who doesn't deserve to be queen. I would be so much better for him, for the kingdom." "By murdering the current queen?" Morrison asked coldly. "By destroying a 15-year marriage and traumatizing the royal children? By corrupting the king and turning him into an accomplice to your crimes?" Lady Camilla's facade of justification began to crumble as Morrison continued to press her. Eventually, the full truth came out. She had been planning this campaign since before she even arrived at court. Her position as a distant cousin of the queen had been a lie, created to give her access to the royal family. Her real background was as the daughter of a minor noble family with extensive debts and political ambitions. The poisoning of Queen Isabella was just one part of a larger plan that included political alliances with dissatisfied nobles and foreign interests that wanted to destabilize the kingdom. Lady Camilla had been promised significant rewards by these allies if she could successfully replace Isabella as queen and gain influence over King Edward. "The king knows nothing about the poison," Lady Camilla insisted when Morrison demanded to know how deeply the king was involved. "He believes Isabella is naturally ill. He has no idea that I'm responsible for her condition." This admission was both a relief and a new source of concern for Morrison. It meant that the king was not complicit in attempted murder, but it also meant that he was completely under Lady Camilla's influence and unaware of her true nature. Morrison gave Lady Camilla a stark ultimatum. She could confess her crimes publicly, provide the antidote to whatever poison she had been using, and accept exile from the kingdom. In return, he would try to keep the king's affair out of the public record and minimize the political damage to the monarchy. Alternatively, she could refuse to cooperate, in which case he would expose everything, including the king's involvement, and she would face trial for treason and attempted murder. Lady Camilla requested time to consider her options, but Morrison refused. "Queen Isabella is dying," he said firmly. "Every hour you delay reduces her chances of recovery. You will make your decision now." Faced with the choice between exile and execution, Lady Camilla finally agreed to cooperate. She provided detailed information about the poisons she had been using and their antidotes. She also gave Morrison a list of her co-conspirators and the foreign agents who had been supporting her plot. The next few hours were critical for Queen Isabella's survival. Dr. Harrison worked frantically to counteract the effects of the poison in her system, using the antidotes Lady Camilla had provided. For a time, it was unclear whether the queen would survive the damage that had already been done to her body. Meanwhile, Morrison faced the delicate task of informing King Edward about what had happened without completely destroying his faith in his own judgment. He decided to focus on Lady Camilla's treason and attempted murder while minimizing discussion of the king's personal relationship with her. The king's reaction was everything Morrison had feared it would be. Edward was devastated to learn that the woman he had fallen in love with was actually a foreign agent who had been manipulating him and trying to murder his wife. His guilt and self-recrimination were so intense that Morrison worried about his ability to continue functioning as a monarch. "How could I have been so blind?" the king asked repeatedly. "How could I have put my family and my kingdom at risk for someone who was using me from the beginning?" Morrison and Thomas worked together to manage the aftermath of Lady Camilla's exposure. She was quietly removed from the castle under heavy guard and transported to a ship that would take her into permanent exile. Her co-conspirators were arrested, and steps were taken to strengthen security against future infiltration attempts. Most importantly, Queen Isabella began to recover as the poison was cleared from her system. The process was slow and difficult, but Dr. Harrison was optimistic that she would eventually regain her full health. The royal children, who had been told only that their mother had been seriously ill, were overjoyed to see her improvement. The political implications of the crisis were managed through careful information control. The public was told that Lady Camilla had been discovered to be a foreign spy who had attempted to poison Queen Isabella. The king's affair was kept secret, known only to a small circle of trusted advisors who understood the importance of protecting the monarchy's reputation. King Edward, chastened by his near-catastrophic lapse in judgment, recommitted himself to his marriage and his duties as a monarch. The experience had taught him painful lessons about the dangers of allowing personal desires to override his responsibilities to his family and kingdom. Thomas found himself promoted to a senior position in the Royal Guard as a reward for his crucial role in uncovering Lady Camilla's plot. But the experience had changed him. He had seen how close the kingdom had come to disaster, how easily a skilled manipulator could threaten everything that generations had built. The crisis had revealed fundamental weaknesses in the castle's security systems and the royal family's vulnerability to internal threats. Morrison and Thomas worked together to implement new protocols and procedures designed to prevent similar infiltrations in the future. As life in the castle gradually returned to normal, Thomas often reflected on the events that had begun with his simple observation of voices in the corridor. A routine security check had uncovered a conspiracy that could have destroyed the monarchy and changed the course of history. It was a reminder that even the smallest details could have enormous consequences, and that vigilance was the price of protecting everything they held dear. Queen Isabella's recovery was complete within 6 months, and she resumed her full duties as queen with renewed energy and purpose. The experience had been traumatic, but it had also strengthened her resolve to serve her people and protect her family. She never learned the full truth about her husband's affair, but she understood that she had been the target of a sophisticated plot, and that her survival was due to the courage and dedication of people like Thomas and Morrison. The kingdom had survived its greatest internal crisis in generations, but the lessons learned would influence royal policy and security procedures for years to come. The price of freedom and stability was eternal vigilance, and those who served the crown understood that their duty was never truly complete.